Thank you for reminding me of something, Castle.
What you got?
I just need to take my meds.
Oh,
Okay, well, we're live.
Hello.
I was spacing out a little bit. We're having a couple people being late, like Mark. Mark is like, Manuel, why did you give me so much homework? I'm just putting him on screen right now. And yeah, no, I want to start with well, not with apologizing. I want to start with thanking Gustav for being an excellent host last time. He took over for me with a purpose as well, because I was trying to change the dynamic in the book club because of multiple reasons. And part of that was like I was trying to have Gustav like provide a different dynamic that I thought might be beneficial. So yeah, thanks to him for that, because that was an amazing book club. Dan, yeah, I want to apologize for having our homework be so much. I think it extended beyond what was necessary, and maybe will drag in some confusion. So like I think we want to finish this part of the book at most, because I don't even think we'll get there. And we'll just leave this issue of time, at least in the way that he's representing it for what it is. Yeah, so like part of the issue in the book club that I was struggling with is that it didn't really have a proper telos. So it was really hard to actually figure out like what are we actually doing, right? Like what does it even mean to read this book and then have a book club about it? And as a consequence of that lack of telos, like I think everybody was a little bit drifting and trying their own approach, and I somewhat invited that with the intention setting part, right? Like everybody gets to have his or her personal intention. And when I was rewriting our Lectio Divina practice, how do we call it now, Mark? Because I keep forgetting.
Exploring narrative meaning.
Exploring narrative meaning, right? Which is like even worse than this book club in some sense, telos wise, because like it's basically guided by inspiration, right? So the intention setting is really important there. And what we decided upon is no, we're just going to give the intention. Because like in some sense it's just too hard to do by yourself. And I thought a little bit more about that idea, and I realized that if you have a common intention, you have a common project, right? And you create a common space. While if you have individual intention, which is fine, but it doesn't build something, right? So it's like in some sense it's relying on something that's already built. And so that wasn't the case with this book club. Like there isn't something that's already built. There's something that gives, well, at least the emanation to build around, right? But like we haven't had the structure build around it, right? And like that's kind of also where this reading was kind of around. It's like giving the body for that heavenly that comes down. So I'm gonna make an imposition from above in order to create coherence, right? And I'm gonna explain why I'm doing this. So I'm struggling with all of this stuff, and I'm reading the book, and we've been talking about, well, like we're gonna do a reflection on last week how the book participated in our lives, right? Like in me it was was really extreme, right? Because it's like I'm struggling with this idea of the book club, and then I'm also reading the book, and then the book informs the idea of the book club while I'm reading it. So I'm like having this multiple layers of coherence going, and I kind of got the telos now, right? Like I got the organizing principle in my head, and I know that everything will fall into its place, and like the problems are not going to be the problems that they were, at least not in the same way, right? There might be new problems, but they're going to have a new shape, right? And that means that I have to engage with something different from now on, right? Like I'm not going to have to be in the same struggle. And in some sense, right, like this higher principle, just like in the book, right? Like you can see it here, right? Like the heavenly light allowed me to appoint or anoint the structure below it in a different way, so that we can now start re-embodying the thing. And this is literally what I want to do, right? So like that happened in me, right? Which is if I'm the emanating principle of the book club, right, or the leader, like I'm having that happen within me, right? And then you can see that there's a reproduction of that principle into the lower, right? So that can happen within each of you too, within your participation, right? And so like that's the thing that I'm gonna try and have happen in this book club, right? Like we're gonna
So,
take
Manuel,
this
could we take a look at those two diagrams, right?
this
Do you
one.
want to throw up this one a second? Yeah, and I just want to put my latest and greatest spinner toy up. If you could take that down for a second, and then what I've got here is going to be something that, at least this is how I kind of visualize some of the diagrams we've been working on this week separately, more in real life. These
Yes.
are happen to be two separate
Like this
pieces,
one,
and then
the same as
the
doing this and holding it up,
right.
and
But this, we were thinking about z-axis,
right.
which is really kind of pulling it out over time in a way. And then the other diagram that you had on the screen before, the one with the circles, yes, that one. So if I can do this right, we can pull that down for a moment. What we've been going through has been mostly circles, and we're going to start getting into squares. And the way that the top one can inform some of the stuff going on. If I can do this
I think we need to wait with this
Yeah.
one. I think this is too far ahead.
So no, I'm just trying to like give some physical visuals to the things that we've seen already, because from my experience this week, we were starting to look at time, but what I was surprised by is that it really kind of did so by squaring the circle, to borrow a phrase from outside our lexicon. So that's just where I
Yes.
wanted to pause you. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Yes. So like well, part of what I wanted to do is take a step back, right? And it's like, okay, like we're reading this book, we're having all these graphs, and there's Bible stories and all, blah 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 blah. But what are we actually doing, right? Like what good is this, right? And like what are we doing? Um, and yeah, I think I'll leave that for after our sharing and intention setting, because I think we still need to do that kind of at the start. So yeah, I wanna invite everybody to take a participatory perspective, right? So like, okay, like we have this diagram. Like, how am I now in this diagram? What is the role I'm fulfilling? What does that mean for my perspective, for my relationships within the dynamic, right? And use that as a springboard for whatever point we want to make, right? So we focus on the participation. And the other thing that I want to do is I want to revisit the participation throughout the book club, right? Because I think when we're in our participation, or revisit the intention, sorry, because I think when we're in that relationality, right, in that participatory perspective, it will reveal things to us, right, and it will rewrite, or like the seeds will start getting a body, right, and it will give new meaning to what it means to be in participation, right, like so there's a recalibration happening at stages. Like I don't even know what a stage is, but I think being in an intentional relationship with that process, right? And in this sense, I'm bringing time in and the renewal, right, which we're not going to talk about this 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 week. Yeah, I want to have these things interact, and I getting a sense of how we're in relationships to them, so that everybody can have an experience similar to what I have had when reading this chapter. And then um like I said, right, like now the book clubs make sense in a different way to me, right, and I know it's all there, right, but it's still hidden because I haven't thought of everything yet, like I haven't given it a body yet. And that will happen progressively during uh, the book club. So that was my experience, and my intention, right? And like I want to, when we're reflecting on the setting of the intention, like I think it's important that we take like a couple of lines to talk about how we're going to do this embodiment, right? So like um I'm going to try and be the heavenly light in some sense, that will shine down, right, and it will create substructures within which new lights can manifest and highlight certain things. So that's the way that I'm going to try and participate. Yeah, who wants next? Castle, you want to?
Yeah, why not? I just wanted to also, without getting into the next part, but just kind of alluding to it, that we're kind of progressing not only in that direction with the book club and our reading, but also in this kind of participation that we're going to start doing. That and I know exactly which diagrams RJ was referring to when he was using his physical representations. And when I was reading that actually just this morning, I noticed, I was like, oh yeah, I had a few insights on that, and then you started talking about the new structure, and also with reference to Mark's stream last night with the authority structure and negotiation, which is all happening here with the restructuring of the book club. I saw that diagram earlier today within that light, and then what you said also flashed to that diagram. So it's not going to become relevant in this one yet, but I think once people kind of get through this book club, even like the people at home listening, that I think next week it's going to become obvious once they see the diagram, and it's like, oh, that happened last week. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to participate in that. And as you're kind of taking on the priestly perspective, I'm going to try to raise matter in the sort of kingly building perspective and try to raise some tangible examples. I have one drawing that I did for this week and a couple of other little things I'll bring when they're relevant, particularly when it comes to the vision of Ezekiel. Very excited about that one. Love that one. But otherwise, going to just try to provide and support with power from below as much as I can for this book club.
Amazing. Mark, you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, my role is to sort of highlight certain things that I have noticed people are missing about the text, and also tie things together when I think people are missing certain pieces. And that's, to Castle's excellent point, more power from below, sort of an attitude, right? Or orientation is probably a better word. And that's, that remains my my goal, is to help to shepherd people through the text, because it is, to the earlier point, that the text in some sense does not contain information or knowledge. It contains the way to connect things together, which is an altogether different way of approaching any kind of text, pretty much, and B, books in general. And that's where I think people struggle the most. And yes, that is where you should struggle the most.
Okay, RJ?
Yeah, so apologies for getting ahead of myself, but that actually brings me to my intention, which I rewrote here. So I'm definitely going to try to stay more moored to the telos of the moment in the discussion, as well as the room generally, with an eye towards the structure of how we're doing things. And specifically, my own personal intention, though it does engage the room, which is not get ahead of myself or others. It's important to hear them out fully, even if I think I'm bringing something in that may layer things that may not always be what the moment is calling for. And then also trying to think about how to bring some of these diagrams into the world that we live in. It's one thing to see a top-down or a side-over view of something like a photograph. It's another thing to be able to notice how much space is actually in between some of those things. But that's not going to be my focus, as my earlier intention was. So over to Danny, I think.
Continue to gain an understanding of the book. I'm hoping that others have enough material to fill most of the time, just because I don't really have a whole lot of generative input over these sections.
Mm-hmm. Did you catch the shared intention that we're going to take?
I was cutting in and out. I heard you describing the process of emanation, and then I heard you saying that you wanted to be the role of the heavenly, the emanate, the source of emanation. I didn't hear an explicit intention for the group.
So the intention for the group is to take a participatory perspective, right? So we're trying to place ourselves within the diagram or the relationship, and embody a side of it, and in some sense be descriptive about our experience of inhabiting that, right? So that we get an example of what these things mean in practice.
Okay, makes sense.
Right. So one of the things, like I don't think I have it ready here, but I'll just use this graph, right? So this is in a hierarchy, and in some sense, the top point, which is the lightest point, it's the principle that lays out everything that's below it, right? So like when we have a telos, the telos starts organizing the world in a certain way for us, so that certain things can be revealed, that meaning in relationship to the telos, and therefore in relationship to us. And so when we take any perspective, right, like now a light starts shining, and it starts laying out reality for us, or the place of our participation for us, right? So that's like the process that we're in, and in some sense this is also what the book is, right? Like the book is showing us a bunch of principles, and these principles lay out the world for us, right? And then what also is important is to see that there's movement, right? Like, so we've been seeing the arrows next to the diagrams, right? Like one movement is down, which means that the principle or the seed is getting a form, a body, right? Like embodiment is something that we'll get into this week. And then the taxation, or like, is in some sense it's giving back to the heavenly identity. It's it's honoring. It's a less obvious thing in some sense, but it's in some sense it's better looked at as fulfillment, right? Like you shape the cup, and then the cup holds water, right? And like the holding of the water is in some sense the having of a body of the light of the principle. So then you want to. What are we doing? I guess we'll leave it for what it is for a second.
It should be a physicalization of that same. There we go, right here. There we go, right here. Hold it up. There we go. So we can see the informing from above. If you can ignore right here in my hand. This way, this actually, in a way of thinking, this can be seen as the same as the diagram. But here we can see the extra space that I mentioned across. Here we have the y-axis, the y-axis, the x-axis, and the flat area we can see is the z. So hopefully that is an appropriate physicalization.
Thank you. So then we've had images like this, right? I'll make some place for Elena. Did you catch what happened so far, Elena?
No, but I think I see what chapter you guys are on.
Yeah, I'm still setting the scene, but I wanted to have us during the book club have as an intention to take a participatory perspective of what we're talking about in relationship to these graphs, and then when we speak from that perspective, and we describe our relationship as we see it, in some sense, to give more body to what we're doing, right? So what I'm doing now is I'm planting a seed in all of you. Like I'm giving the opportunity for this perspective, right? That I now share to grow, right? This intention, so that it can reveal whatever comes out of it. And like I think that would be fruitful, right? And in some sense, I'm taking an authoritative perspective of saying, well, like this is the right way of being at this point in time. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So I'm going through what we've actually been doing, right? So here on the left side, we see basically the coming of heaven and earth together, and in the coming together, something new is created, and the something new has the quality of being an image of that which comes together, right? And so like you can see it on the left hand side, and you see it recreated on the right hand side, and so if we look at it, well, I guess I'll use my epic contribution this time. It's it's a whole lot of stuff, but I wanted to say, right? So you have Adam, who's like an image, right? That's what straight lines is, and this is Adam as created by God, and then he gets separated into Adam and Eve, right? Which one is representative of the heavenly, and the other one is representative of the earthly, right? And so what we've been going through is we have iterations or relationships of the microcosm, right? Like the image, and then how the image gets split up, right? And so what happens with Adam and Eve is Adam gets separated into Adam and Eve, and then a failure happens, right? And they fall down out of the garden, right? And then you have Cain and Abel. They have a failure, and that one gets replaced by Set, right? And Set is in some level a redemption, right? And then you have Noah, who's like a godly character, right? He fails, right? And then you get a new established order with his first son being a new image, I think, and then his other sons having to serve the other, right? So and then you have a failure in the third son as well, right? So there's a pattern here in the Bible that is recreated in different manners, and if you use these diagrams, you can get a sense of what is being explored, right? And so it's the relationship of the upper, that which gives identity, right, with the lower, which takes identity or provides the holder, the carrier of the identity. And so what we've been doing in this book club is we've been going through different ways of looking at this, right? Like what does it mean for something to be on top, right? Like being the heavenly. What does it mean for something to be the earthly? And then we've gone like through many iterations. And maybe I'll stop talking here and have people fill in. Okay. So in some sense, that which comes from above is like the imposition, right? Like it demands something from you, right? And the demand is flowing from the identity or the principle that is upholding it, right? So like that, the example that I'm like, okay, everybody set your intention like this, right? Like now I'm placing a demand, right? And then everybody can use that structure to assume an identity and inform their participation as a consequence. And so in the chapters that we're going to read, we're going to focus on the role of movement and mediation, right, within this. So that's important. Like I want to go through two more things. So here you have embeddedness. So you have the pattern at a high level, then you have the pattern at a lower level, and then you have the pattern at a more specific level, right? And so they're doing the same, but they're reflections on a different level of reality, right? And Mark has been really nice to point out that there's different rules at the different levels, right? So there's a different relationship, right? And so if we go back to the things that I wrote down here, right? Like the sequences of these things are different, right? So the images of God are at different places, and the failures are different, and therefore you get a different rule set, or you get a different scenario that occurs as a consequence. And yeah, I think Arthur, you want to get your epic whatever thing you showed up first, right? I'll start here, right? So you have you have this thing, right, which is heaven and earth are at the bottom, right? And so you can look at heaven and earth here, right, as the yin and yang. They're at the bottom, right? And so now I'm going to rotate it, right? And so the heaven and earthly are spinning around below, right? And now we go back to here, right? Below God, right? So God is all the way up here, and heaven and earthly things are basically moved by God, right? And then the question is, well, like how does that work, right? Like there's something in between. I don't think that was the one with the spiral up, like.
No, yeah, I'm just juxtaposing
Okay.
the Enoch thing. This is what you were thinking of a moment
Yes,
ago.
that one, yes.
But let's have this on here so people can really see it. Let me put it on my notepad. Shoot, you know, okay, we're going with this now. So here we have the center node, and we can see how the note is not actually touched in a way, despite the articulation. So whereas we've covered kind of a x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis, what we've begun to start seeing are colored arrows. And if it's colored, we'll get to it in just a moment. But if it's colored versus uncolored, is something to pick up on. But that directionality of the arrow, this could be up, this could be down. It depends on context and perspective. So with that, I think maybe
right, and so it's important to say, right, like this ball is in the center, right, like it's what we see in the center of these graphs, and in the center there's a necessary image, right? So we go back to the left hand side here, right? Like Adam is an image that gets produced in the coming together of that which is above and that which is below, right? And then at the bottom, right, like you have again, right, like this microcosm that's having this yeah, like now you get into spatial things, right? But it's two parts, like the one is the receiving part, and the other one is the giving back part, that together form a singular identity, right? And so like the principle is now divided into a two, and the two is now having an identity under the principle. Like maybe that's the best way to say it. Yeah, does anybody want to step in here?
I do actually. So to that point, I have a couple of props of my own that I wanted to show. So this kind of idea of the simple principle from above, and then the more complex sort of fruit bearing from below. This was a thing I told Mark about this, that I would probably bring something up. So, and it's not important to know exactly what this is, but at church, there's a nice guy that I've gotten to know, and I had done a project for him before. And so one of the things that he does is he leads people after Mass most weekdays in something that's called the St. Michael Chaplet. And so, and you don't need to know what that is, but it's like a 20-minute prayer. And he was like, I had done another project in a similar fashion to this, and he said, hey, can you do something with this? So what he gave me here was a piece of paper that had an image, a little bit of embellishment, mostly just some words on that. And he said, hey, can you do something with this? So he lowered the identity, he lowered the seed of what it was that was supposed to do. Very simple, very plain. But it contained all of the information that you actually need in order to do the thing. And then what I had, immediately when he handed me that, it reminded me that there was an icon that I have. I have a larger one of this, but I have a little one here. So this is a nice little wooden icon. And I thought, what if I could combine this piece of wood that I have, and then combine that with the simple piece of paper that he gave me that has all of the instructions. And then so that day, what I went ahead and did is I sort of raised matter and lowered meaning to make this card. And so the background, there's a little bit of glare here from the light, but the background is actually kind of a wood texture. And then it has color and more detailed instructions, but all of the same text is exactly the same on the other one. But there's just additional embellishment, and it's been kind of raised a little bit, but also offered more support. And then where he had given me one of those, and I'm all done with the props, but where he had given me one of those simple sheets of paper, I then provided him with 50 of those the following week. And so I received the seed and then provided seed-bearing fruit. And then that was then scattered about to a bunch of other people who partook and were now able to participate, whereas he only had a small handful of these. And it's also a nice little thing to look at, and people have told me that they keep it on their nightstand or what have you. So that's a nice little example, I think, in my own experience of being able to kind of participate in it.
Right. So that's an amazing example, and I want to exemplify what I mean, right? So in order to receive the seed, right, something was required of you, right? Like, so you had to establish a certain relation. So can you reflect on what was required and how you responded to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was receptive to it. So one of the things that, in many ways, the ground had been tilled on that one, because he asked me, he was like, "Oh, are you familiar with this?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I do it every day," and it had been for like a year or something like that. And he was like, "Oh, well, maybe you can do something with that." But I was already open to it. Like I had also been subordinated under this guy, so he's a Knight of Columbus, and recently invited me to join as well. So it's kind of that same pattern happening at the same exactly in the same way, but at a larger scale. But he is the leader, and he's also a former doctor and a much old guy, probably in his 70s or something like that. So I see him as authority on multiple different levels. And then he's the leader of these things every single time. So I had already subordinated myself to his mission in something else. And then he had kind of just lowered the thing, and I was already ready to support. I had already supported a prior thing before, so he knew that I could kind of produce the seed bearing fruit as well. So that's just kind of something that we're also trying to scale up a little bit more, almost parish wide, but we're trying to get some review from the master on that. But yeah, it was definitely something that I was already open to, and that I had also had a lot of the skills and experience to kind of be able to produce something like that before. So there was that, and there was also a lot of time. So receiving that, even though I did it the same day, it would took like 8 hours of work. And something that will come up later, I don't want to harp on this too much just yet, but one thing that often happens, and we'll see it in the vision of Ezekiel, is that when he receives the heavenly pattern that he's supposed to host, there is a waiting period where he's also greatly distressed. And one thing that I also find myself when I'm doing an art project like this or something is that right in like the last 30 minutes when everything has been going well, there comes a point of tension where I'm about to finish the thing where I find imperfections and I want to destroy it and myself. And so there's just, I'm like, this has to be perfect. I need to do the thing and everything. And that's the type of thing that would drive me to stay up until midnight doing this thing because I had to get it done. But it's kind of like a birth pain sort of situation that needs to happen. It usually doesn't happen until much, much closer to the end.
Yeah, so that's where I wanted to go, right? So there's something required in the receiving, and there's something required in the giving back, right? And like it seems that you feel that really intensely. So I'm yeah. Do you want to like shed a little bit of light on what it is, right? Like you're feeling, because you're focusing on one aspect over another, right? Like there's things that you want to perfect and things you don't want to perfect, right? So like is there a sense of that's related to you or to the telos, or like how do you see that?
I think there was a point where I felt like the identity had already been manifested in it properly, and I was doing a lot of proofreading and stuff, and that wasn't so much the problem. I don't mind proofreading even for hours at a time. But one of the things that I had was getting the alignment right on a lot of the on the image elements, and then being able to make it so. And this was a major thing. Mark and I were talking about Canva a lot yesterday. One of the things that I found was that the form that I was taking of producing this, which I normally use, was a booklet form, and that it turns out had a page limit. So I didn't have enough body to manifest this. I only had 4 pages, and there's a minimum of 8 for a booklet. So I wanted to self-destruct because I had basically everything ready. And so this is actually technically a greeting card. And that was an insight that I got, which was just a major flash that I received right at like 11 p.m. or something, and I made a lot of changes. But I had to resize a lot of stuff because it was much taller on the booklet because there's different dimensions and whatnot. But that was one of those things that being able to finalize hosting the meeting so that it could actually be produced as a body, and I could hit send so that I could make the print done, because I wanted it to happen within a certain amount of time. And maybe I was trying to force the renewal as well, and that might have also caused some unnecessary pain.
Yeah, and so that brings me back to this thing, right? So in some sense you get a process like in the center. You get a nesting of something, right? And then the nesting inherits something from above, and then the coming together of heaven and earth in the first graph, and then mediation needs to happen, right? Like now, like it becomes part of that process, right? Like by being it on a smaller scale.
On that
becomes-
very note, Manuel, I'd just like to point out something about the graph that was not immediately obvious to me. It's a strange detail and uncertain way of thinking. But do you see how there is the circle inside of the left hand in the center, but not on the right hand?
Yeah.
So I just want to call that to the reader's attention, just generally, because that might suggest that here we see Seth, Noah, and Enosh inlaid into Adam, Cain, and Abel in a way. I don't have the right answer for how to figure this out or look at this. It itself is cross-dimensional in a way. This could represent a fair number of things, but it is important to notice that there is not a node inside Seth, Noah, and Enoch the way that the other two have here.
Would you say that it's just that the pattern hasn't perpetuated past that instantiation yet?
It would depend on the context of the discussion. If I'm understanding your framing right, then yeah, one could see as it's an expression going down into microcosm from left to right in that sense.
The smallest unit is family.
Yeah.
And so, like, I also want to point out this idea, right, where, like, in my example, right, like I was wrestling with all the issues in the book club, right, and so they're on, well, the analogous level of the family, right, like that's where the problem is, right, like there's a situation that has a limited scope, right, and if you resolve something a couple layers up, right, like now the way that the family organizes or the image that the family takes is changed as a consequence of its inheritance, right? And so, like, I don't want to go to Jesus, right, but like if we go all the way with the nesting, right, which is like a family line in some sense, a spiritual family line, and then at a certain point, the end point, right, or the fulfillment says something over the whole line, right? Like it redeems it, right? Like if there is actually an end point or a completion, then it flips the whole line. It grants it a new identity, and I think that's what we're seeing with these stories, right? Like we're especially in Genesis, you get this build up, right? Oh, like, oh, Adam and Eve had this thing go wrong, right? And like now we establish it on a different level, and then we can redeem the previous mistake a little bit, right? But then we get a new problem. So there's this assumption of a new identity. I see this as discovery, right? So you discover a new principle, and then you organize around it, and then you start implementing the organization, right? Now you get a new structure, right? Like you get new rules, you get new effects, right? And like now you discover something again, right? And this is progressivism in some sense, right? Like you progress throughout the patterns, right? And if you do that correctly, or if you keep doing the microcosm thing, that we go back to the image of God and not to the image of yourself, right? Because like that's what happens, and that people created images of themselves instead of images of God, and then things went horribly wrong. Then you reveal the heavenly, right? Like it gets progressively revealed to you. So in some sense, you start creating an alignment to the heavenly as a group, right? Because that's also the thing that you do, right? Like you increase the size. So you start off at the level of the individual, then you start on the level of family or group, right? So this is analogous to to the Exodus, right? Going out of Egypt, that's the level of the group. And then you establish yourself in the land, right? And when you've established yourself, you're a nation, and the nation has different rules, right? Like that's a higher level, and you get law, and well, we'll get back to it because I have comments about that.
Can I just delineate the word nation for a moment? Nations have fathers, and in a way, the father of the nation is the primus. So I don't want to sidetrack getting into things like rank and authority and things like that, but in as much as structure holds some of those things, it is important, I think, just to acknowledge that the primus highest point does also inform, and that has relationships with certain elements of law codes depending upon your culture or territory, whatever you want to call it. Certainly within Western context. But thank you for this for the space to make the comment.
Yeah, so I want to start with the first page of 26 now, because I feel like we're there now. So for me, this is about how to form a good body in some sense, and it's laws for the people, right, which is an imposition from above, and plans for the temple, which is an ability to reach up, right? So in some sense, that's the closing down and the opening up perspectives, and a participatory part of that as well. Yeah, so the children of Israel get asked to make a sanctuary to dwell, so that God can dwell among them. So I think maybe we want to have some reflection on what that means for God to dwell among something.
The best way I can gesture at this, as far as an element of what it means to have that which is highest be able to dwell amongst us at this level, is actually Exodus 1. It's not what we see up here on screen, which is Exodus 25, but Exodus 1 says, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings a sacrifice to the Lord, you shall bring your sacrifices of animals from the herd or the flock." And it doesn't sound exactly related to the temple until you think about the context of when we're moving into building the temple, we currently have the tabernacle. So the tabernacle is associated with sacrifice. And that actually goes back to our earlier conversation around discernment, or at least bringing things up higher and lower, relating to the relevance of and saliency of different elements of identity and body. Sacrifice also partakes in some of that pattern. And so where we see the plans and legislation for these things, we're looking at the structure that needs to be had an eye to when you are building the structure, which is the place to do some of that discernment.
Yeah, and I think at the bottom it's having a footnote, right, about raising matter, and I think the word refinement has been used before, and I think a different word would be perfection, right? Because that's what it means for God to dwell among people is that the perfection gets manifested in some way, or at least it gets shown and gets partaken in.
I would push back a little bit on perfection. I might say correctly aligned participation.
Yeah, but that is a perfection, right?
Perfection's a funny word, man.
Yeah, it is.
That's just my 2 cents and my pushback. But
no, I agree. Like it's not perfection in in a material sense. It's a perfection of a
If we weren't
relationship
talking
or
about
something.
time in the next chapter, I wouldn't have pushed back.
Okay. Well, but that's the complexity that gets moved in, right? That's important.
Now, when you say perfection, are you alluding sort of to like completeness through that unification?
Right, or getting as close to the ideal as possible. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
And that closeness to the ideal can only be achieved through participation. That's where I put forward my word choice.
Right. And down the second bit, which is contrasted or whatever, like I don't even know if it's contrasted, but it's talking about an arc, which I think is made from wood, overlaid with gold, right? And so the wood, which is I assume is associated with living things, right, gets overlaid with gold, which is a skin, but it's also the heavenly, right? Like it's we saw the pyramid, right? Like it's the top of the pyramid, right? And in some sense, it therefore gets a divine skin. And then within that container, which is interesting, it has a container. Testimony gets put, and so I want to contrast testimony here with the naming of animals that Adam gets charged with. So instead of naming the animals, now it's naming, in some sense, the relationship with God or something, right? Like it's naming the heavenly principles, and it's aimed to the realm of experience now. Yeah, that's what I had on this.
So I also just want to make a slight, a clarification. Exodus does come before Leviticus. Leviticus is the book of the regulations of the priesthood class. The way I ended up having to bring that up here is in a way because this chapter 26 is looking at stuff or presenting stuff in a way which is similar to, in framing, rules and regulations for the priestly class.
Right. I will get into that in 27, I think. So.
And I also wanted to call back to the relationship of Cain and Abel just when discussing sacrifice, just making the, I guess, Wikipedia blue links between what I was saying.
I had just a few quick notes on this one. One of the things I love in this book is honestly just the notes that are at the bottom of the pages are where usually like my favorite stuff usually is. But I did really like the way that in the beginning and the end of this particular chapter that he kind of makes the connection between the Israelite women politely asking the Egyptian people for their gold and treasure and everything like that, and that is what is sort of pillaged is maybe a little aggressive, but that's usually the term that the people use, and that's how they kind of raise the matter so that they could have the materials to make the tabernacle and everything in the first place. And then he kind of connects that in a later note about how the building of the temple is a job that belongs to the kingly and warrior-like tribes like Judah and Dan. And building the temple eventually comes down to King Solomon and not his dad, King David, who could have done it and would have done it. We're not getting into time yet, but there was some things that I might bring up in later chapters about that and why David wasn't able to do it and his son had to. But I just wanted to kind of bring that up, just kind of re-solidifying, if you would, the sort of earthly part of raising up that material and then kind of offering it up to then be applied to the higher things. And that, the gold in many ways is kind of like the oil of the precious metals because it's sort of reflective to light quite a bit. And then I just wanted to mention the two cherubim. Then it's the sort of thing of the that the word or the new information that's coming through to everybody, or the third thing is coming out of the two.
Yeah, we'll get into that because I think there's more about the cherubim later.
Yeah, I think it was just the three things pattern that we've been seeing over and over again. I just wanted to allude to there, but that's all I got for this chapter.
Okay. So it's interesting. So we have this graph here where there's an information, right, and a being formed, a conformation, right, and how they come together, and that gets done by a voice or a expression, I guess, of a source, and then there's something that is being informed, right? That's receiving the complexity of the message and reconstructing its meaning in some sense, right? And I think when we're talking about the raising up, right? Like I think words like perfection, but fulfillment, glory is also a word I'd put there. Like so, there's a refinement. There's a quality, the appearance of quality. Maybe that's the way that you should think about it, where the quality is drawn from the materials into a expression that's unique and thereby also valuable, appreciable. And like I think it's important to say, right, like now the temple gets introduced as a physical place where this pattern is taking place, right? Like it's so instead of the person being the microcosm, now we're creating the microcosm in an area of participation, right? So we're now having an arena in which we can place ourselves, we can contemplate, right? So if we go sit at the space of the temple, then we can stand in between these patterns, right? And we'll get into that a little bit later.
So on that point, the tabernacle moves with the people, and the temple, obviously, it's not like you can pack up a huge stone building very easily. That also moving to the temple, having a specific center place, does change certain dynamics and other things, and we'll see that as we go forward. But the establishment of the temple is the establishment of the what's it called? The mountain of the world, the great holy mountain, basically the omphalos of the world, and that becomes the center point. And while things are placed around the tabernacle and things are around the temple, it's a little bit different. In a way, it's actually much more stable, more earthly, and actually more heavenly at the same time.
RJ, is this a good place to ask you to talk about the shading of the arrows, or is there a better picture that we'll get into what you want to talk about with that?
We're not quite there yet. At the end of the previous chapter, we saw some slight shading. We don't see anything here on page right now.
Well, there's light and dark.
Right,
which is still significant, but yeah, it's going to get more significant later.
It is a good thing to keep an eye out for. We do see that they are upwards arrows that are shaded black, which we're familiar with, but it's important to notice and pay attention to any specific diagram as is.
But if you look at the top diagram, another way to think about that is a Western representation of yin and yang, with the white dot in the middle, right, and the black dot on the top, right? That is as close as you're going to get in Western thought to what the yin yang represents in Eastern thought.
And it's interesting that the text necessarily had to do white letters in the black. So it's actually creating the word aspect there as well.
Well, and that's more also representative of unique contrast to C, which is also represented in the East and the yin yang. But again, it's because of the way they think, and we don't think the way they think. See the Geography of Thought, wonderful book. It's because of that we don't see that we have all that same imagery here in the West, and it's always been there.
Mark, do you have any thoughts on how, in the vein of the Geography of Thought, moving from a tabernacle to a temple can change things?
Well, that's the motion of the yin yang. When you spin your little spinny thing, that's what that is, effectively, right? It's just that, yeah. In Eastern thought, the motion is always you, and in Western thought, the motion is around action. Right? In other words, the frame of reference in Eastern thought tends to be more centered around the individual, ironically enough. And the frame of reference in the Western thought is more focused around the actions of the individual because, again, very ironically, and this is going to sound hard to believe, the relationships are more important in the West because the objects are more concrete and well known. Whereas the intuitive factor is actually flipped in the East. And that's actually why the imagery ends up different or different seeming. And it is different, and that's also why people get confused. And then when you merge the two thoughts, or you try to merge the two thoughts in the way that people have done, you end up very confused and think they're different, when in fact there's no reason to merge them because they're identical.
Is some of that a traditional translation issue between language as well?
Yeah, but again, a lot of it, and this is just a theory, I can't stand by it, but a lot of it seems to be, look, Alan Watts was around a bunch of people who got thrown out of their countries because they were heretics. And so it's not like he had pure Eastern thought to draw from to begin with. And that's actually kind of significant, right? Like if you're starting from bad theology, if you will, this is how we'd say it in the West, you're going to get bad results. And so Alan Watts started from bad theology from the East and got bad results. And there's no that I can argue. I can't argue that that's where all what I call Western Buddhism comes from, because there might be many other sources.
So I knew I had it somewhere, and it's so interesting that you put up this the same pattern, RJ. But like I made the progression from the garden to the tabernacle to the temple, right? So first you have a static place, right? Then you have something that's moving, and then you have something that's established, right? And so we can analyze this with the personal, and then the tribal, and then the national. And what is the? Oh yeah. So I frame it a little bit different, right? But the garden, they're bound, right? They're under an authority, and then the tabernacle gets created in the desert, which is a place of transition, right? So they don't have a home, right? And then the temple is again, it's a binding. It's a binding to a physical place, which is actually transcended in Christianity, because like we actually need to do the heavenly Jerusalem beyond that to finish the next step in the pattern. But the problem with the binding, and you can see this later in the Bible, is that people can come in and like crush your temple, right? Just like they fell out of the garden, they fell out of the promised land. And then you get back into the transitionary stage, right? But like in the transitionary second stage, they didn't have the tabernacle anymore, but they did have their history, right? They did have their traditions, and in some sense they could refine them. But it's important to realize that this thing of being bound, right, which is connected to hierarchical structures and all of that, and it is it is requiring, like Mark said, like it's putting some real importance on the relationships that you have to that, right? And I think that's where the whole thing of worship in the temple and having these patterns to participate in becomes really important, because that's the pattern that maintains the structure, right? Like it maintains the ability to properly interface with the hierarchy effectively, right? With the binding that you have. While in the Eastern thought, I think it's why the hierarchy gets more brutally established through power, uh, and not so much through bondage. And
Right.
yeah,
And hierarchy is assumed in the East, and hierarchy in the West is justified.
If on those last two comments, gentlemen, which I think were quite well put, on page 95 of the physical copy, which is on the following page of the diagrams we were just looking at, Matthieu specifically says, with the analogy of written language. So that's an important thing, at least from my perspective. But if we can use that, not even full sentence, and go back to the preceding page, it's 83 in the digital copy. And we can see here how if Matthieu is looking at language as an analogy, how the bottom diagram in the context of the East and West discussion can actually make some things some more salient. So I just want to stop and see if that occurs to anything for anyone, and then I might add my own thoughts.
well, like if we go to the Western tradition, right, we have logos, right, which is language, but or the word or that which language originates from, right, like the intelligibility that the language is trying to describe. So it's kind of like what's the level of analysis that you're looking at this, right? Because he's using a material example, right, but there's a spiritual correlate to this, right? Like the voice is an instruction, right? Like it is meaning coming together into a point that expresses something, right? And I think that's probably the right way to read this.
So for me, and this is in part why I asked the question of Mark that I did about language. From my perspective, if we're acknowledging that the book is flat, and we're acknowledging that language is an analogy, and then we're looking at Marx being transitioned into, from Marx to disorganized letters to organized letters into the word voice, which is coming down in this diagram. There is a level of, going back to your stuff, Manuel, going from unbound to exodus to bound to diaspora. And I want to delineate exodus from transition. And exodus, I recently heard it put, is when someone has lost their home and has no home to go towards, as opposed to a diaspora where there is a home to return to. And I would argue with a tabernacle, you can't actually enter into a diaspora. It's only potentially with a temple that in the sense of the geography of thought, ends up coming into play. I don't want to stand on that with any kind of this is what this means, but this is something that became salient to me during my read through.
Yeah, I want to have one correction, because Exodus is not domicide. It's different than domicide. Because in Exodus, you have a promise of God. Like they have a promised land and they're actively walking towards it and they're being guided.
I don't want to quibble. I come from a different tradition. I would suggest going through Exodus, which the book actually kind of asks of you to do. I don't want to get into different perspectives on that.
Well, like I don't think we should get into the perspectives, but it's important to realize that yes, there's different perspectives, and I'm gonna put on this crazy diagram, right? And it's like, okay, so the promised land is the heavenly light, right? Like there's and Moses is drawn to it in some sense. And then you get
Moses also is specifically does not get into the Holy Land, and that's part of what makes Moses Moses. I'm really not
right.
trying to.
Let me finish, right? Because it's important, right? So you can imagine that there's different levels on the hierarchy, right? And they have different revelations, right? Like they have different participations in the walk, right? Like some might be aware of where they're going, about the decision making that's happening, right? Others might just like have to walk in faith because like they don't get any information from the top effectively, right? So it's important to realize that all these levels, they have a different perspective towards the heavenly light, right? To some people it's just an abstract promise. Like other people share part of the vision that Moses has, right? And you can see that in the problems that arise during the travel, right? Like it's different layers that rebel for different reasons in different manners, and like
Right.
that.
I would only add that I see the heavenly light much more clearly in the pillar of fire, for example. Um, but I don't disagree with anything you just said. So, but I think it's a good thing to go into because we are moving into the temple. So I think it's important to delineate what it was that came before in a way.
Right.
And thank you for entertaining me on all this.
So it's important. Like I really liked that host on the top hosted a completely different meaning or spirit, which is interesting because he's effectively equating meaning and spirit, right? Like as like the spirit is giving the meaning in some sense, right? Or a different way to see that is the principality that organizes your participation is giving the meaning, and then it's empty hello, right? Which I really like that wordplay. That's amazing that he found that one. um, yeah, no, another thing that I want to say about the what is it, the ark and the tents that were around it, the tabernacle. Yeah, that was a thing that was constantly broken down and built up, right? So there's a renewal there. Uh, and a reestablishment, and like we'll get to that in the next part of the book, because it's important, because like that's connected to the phase of Exodus, and that's not there in the garden, and it's not there when the temple is established, or at least not in that manner. So that is important. So yeah, that's kind of what I had. Okay, then we'll go to the next chapter.
If we could read what's written here between the altar and the tent, I think that's actually pretty important.
Okay, I'll read it out loud. I will sanctify the tent of meeting and the altar, and Aaron and his sons I will sanctify as my priest. I will dwell among the children of Israel and be their God, and they will know that I am the Lord their God.
And then numbers 1 and 2, I think, are actually pretty important in the immediately following paragraph. Specifically, an altar on the east side, and 2, a tent on the west side.
Right, and then it's important to say that there's a priest as a mediator, and that this altar and the tent were, at least by Pageau, compared to technologies, right, which introduces this idea of psychotechnologies from Vervaeke, right, like ways of relating to the world that allow you to reveal something of the world, and have a certain participation with it, right, and so like this is now actually a physical arena which has been erected, which in the priest can take place and literally embody it, right? So like if we go to Vervaeke's idea of the Range Rover, like that people start seeing from a perspective of the Range Rover, right? Like I imagine that this tabernacle is fulfilling a similar function, right? And like I want to go back to this idea of what we're doing in the book club, right? Like I think we want to kind of take that attitude as well, right? It's like what does it mean that I'm like in the temple right now, right? And I'm relating to the book club, right? Like so there's a mediative aspect, right? Like what is the altar, right? Like what is my contribution so that I can make the book club more refined, right? Like so I have a personal refinement, and I can give that to the book club so that the book club becomes more refined. And then there's also like this aspect of the tent where I'm like I can be the voice, like this more directive aspect, but like okay, we should go here, or like we should have our attention there, or whatever.
Well, I think it's going to become significant in the next chapter, but the note I want to make is that you have a single mediator here, and the single mediator is from east to west, and the single mediator is mediating between that which is informed and that which conforms explicitly. And that's going to become more significant in the next chapter. But I wanted to point that out because it's super important to sort of realize that there are different forms of mediation, and maybe there's a hierarchy of mediation, as we'll see later. And I think that's, and again, this is the scaling problem, right? At the scale of the earthly interaction, we'll call it, this is the proper mediation, and it's more, it's not fully, but it's more horizontal. So that, again, the mediation is from the thing that's receiving from above to the thing that's bringing up from below, and so you can think of it on one hand as the lowering has to be mediated across, right, to the raising, right. And I know it seems backwards, but that's actually what he's talking about.
So I kind of briefly redrew specifically just the tent pieces, the altar piece, and the middle piece here, and I did my best to try to bring out some of the ways in which the two what's the word, rhombus structures, tent structure, and such, would have potentially different dimensions, even if you're being flat about it. Just mostly to call out that while they're the same shape, they're, in my mind at least, they're going to have a little bit of a directionality to them. The stronger piece on the right may be the top piece. The stronger piece on the left may be the bottom piece. This is something that I'm adding to the text, looking just at these diagrams. Something that I find makes salient and relevant other things down the road.
Yeah, and I think you can draw a Star of David because that's the same thing.
Oh, I didn't think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would just support that we're going to see in sort of unfolding over the next few chapters that there is kind of an association between the upper half, and then also the right side is going to have a sort of association, and then also the left side and the lower half is going to have a sort of association that's related to maybe more body but less information on the left and lower part, and then kind of the alternative for the upper and right parts.
Right, and so I think it's important to see that if we go down to the tabernacle, now it's split up again, right? And you can see that it's moving like a microcosm within the tent, which is on the right side, I think. And like Mark said, right? Like there's a alignment from east-west and a north-south, and there's different mediations, and like I made this connection a little bit later, but that's also the cross, right? Like the cross is a mediation north-south and east-west, and they come together in some sense, right? They have a center.
That is something I noticed. That I was like, oh wow, Matthieu's so clever, assuming he was doing it intentionally. That I was like, oh, these diagrams, especially the simpler ones where it's just the upper half and then the lower half and then the line in between. It's like I can't actually point at that and like point at the two halves and then the other one without blessing the page, And it's like, oh, that's interesting.
That's funny.
Patterns are real, man. They happen.
So I have a lot of notes on this part because like that was amazing, and here we also get into the Ark of the Covenant, right? And it says it was meant to reflect, reproduce, and even represent God within creation, right? So reflection would be, yeah, like they're different quality words. So like I don't like I guess I want to highlight that they're different qualities. I don't know how to speak about them.
Manuel, before you start on your notes, maybe I could just share my question about this section just to help you frame it a little bit more. So he makes the comment there's a difference between hosting and receiving spirit. In what way does the hosting versus receiving identity change the role of heaven and earth, or the symbol within that entire interaction? I just wanted to hear everybody's thoughts on that. What happened? Because he just kind of states that, but the implications of that aren't super
Yeah,
clear.
I think it's important to see that reflected in what's written down here, right? So reflect, reproduce, and represent is a receiving, right? So like there's God's identity, right? And that gets mediated through the golden box, right? Like it gets shown, right? And then there's a different aspect, right? Which is hosting, right? Like the hosting is giving it back up, right? So it's an it's adopting that the image of God or the reflection of God in you, right? And letting that transform you, right? Change you in God's image so that you can be more like God, right? And then that's you giving it back up. Like that's hosting that.
Could I ask, would you mind putting up the diagram of the kind of pointed structure with the kind of descending multiplicity? Yeah. So I wanted to just kind of point out that also the way that the way that all the tribes were assembled out there, this would be kind of like a side view of that, but that they were all of the tribes were arranged in sort of increasing hierarchy from the sort of worker class to the kingly class to the priestly class, all the way up, and that it was actually sort of squared, so they were all actually facing cardinal directions. And then so you had this kind of the raising up and properly arranging of the society itself, and then they're also receiving the laws down. And so like you're saying, it's kind of it's a that they've been sort of prepared, or at least the attempt was made so that they could then start hosting. God's intention is to go and start to dwell among them, so it's happening also at the different microcosms, as you were saying. So like the specific person is experiencing that, and then also societally they're experiencing that, and then it's happening at the same time with the inside the temple as they're constructing it, also that those things can kind of fit together and like stack into each other, so that that God can then be properly hosted in there.
And it's maybe interesting to look at the words that are used here, right? So anoint ointment, right? Like that's putting the ointment on, right? The oil, which is changing your skin, right? Like it's gaining a new identity, right? So the heavenly light is permeating new identity through the hierarchy, right? And the taxation, right, is in some sense it is the response of the hierarchy in that in the adoption of the new identity, right? So you could say, well, like, okay, we're creating an army, right? And in order to create an army, we need to train, right? And like now, like we need to train cavalry, we need to train archers, we need to train foot soldiers, right? And then we need to train them in formations, right? So there's a different level of training, different level of union, right? And at a certain point, right, that comes back together as a well-functioning army, right? Which is glory in a sense, right? You can just get these the Nazis marching through the street, right? Like in their parade, and there's something gloriful in in the way that things function together, that they show together, right? Like it's um and then you have the parades that happen after battle, right? Where the glory is received by having executed as an army, right? Like so, like the glory of a battle is we fulfilled the role of an army properly, right? And so that glory, right? That's in some sense the representation of the divine on earth. Um, so in the middle, there's a talking about the transmission of Adam's full identity from the male half to be reproduced within the female half, right? So it's an interesting word that he uses there, transmission, right? So there's a laying on of identity, right? Or better, like on this level, the word is mission, right? So there's a submission and a transmission, right? And and they unify in a mission, right? And so yeah, I wanted to point at the word mission and identity and how they're relating. Um, and then at the bottom it says, simply stated, one must feed the spiritual to make it visible, explicit, detailed, and tangible. So in other words, like things like a spiritual principle needs to be adhered to in order to be seen, and that requires faith, right? You have to believe in what you're doing, uh, and then it starts taking form, right? You can start understanding, right? Like we were talking about understanding, like the forms that are taken of it are our understanding of it, or they form our understanding of it, um, and that provides our ability to to have intelligibility of of that heavenly principle, right? And it it's interesting because there's two ways that we can have faith, right? Like in some sense we can have like a sort of like a natural faith where things emerge, right? Like we just end up in this pattern because it's unavoidable. Like the pattern needs to happen, right? Like the situation calls for the pattern, right? And that's a way that we can discover them. But there's also a way in which we can faithfully choose to live the pattern. And then we don't have to wait until the discovery by calling, but we can actually make like a covenant in some sense, right? Like we bind ourselves to this pattern, with the promise that the pattern will create the right result for it.
How do you?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just gonna pick a little bit. What do you mean by choose? How does that work?
Well, like there's
When you
a
choose to have
bunch.
faith?
Well, I can come to you, right, and I can propose marriage to you, right, and then you get to choose.
You have to say a little bit more.
Well,
What
what am
in
I
the
doing?
context of faith? In the
Right.
context
Well,
of
but
faith,
you
what is
have,
it?
in order for you to say yes, right, you have to believe in me, right? Because what am I doing when I make a proposition? Well, like I'm basically saying, well, your future will be this, right? Like whatever this is, but I will make it happen, right? That's what I'm doing with that proposition. And you can just live it, right? You can never even marry. You can just like, oh yeah, we just hang out and we end up hanging out our whole lives, right? Or we can say no, like we enter into marriage, right? And then we bind, right? And in that binding there's a bunch of promises, right? Like that's two different things to act out the same pattern in some different ways.
Okay, but what does choosing in faith mean? Like if
Well,
I, what
like basic
in the
basic
position that you have a choice, what's the experiential
Well, the okay, well,
of
the
that choice?
experiential part is the leap of faith, right? Like basically you're saying something, yes to something that you don't know, right? And if you just hang out with me all the time, then you never have to say yes, right? Or the yes is only to today, right? Like I show up at the book club, right? And like that's enough of a yes for now, and I don't have to make the commitment, right? But like if you make the commitment, right, like now you can build upon the commitment, right? Like so when Israel builds the temple, right, now they've committed, right? They say like, no, this is the place of God, right? So that's a source of strength, right? Because like now they can go there to worship, right? They can build a city around it, right? Like they can build a whole lot of things, but it's also a vulnerability, right? Because if the temple gets attacked, right, now the source of their identity gets attacked, right, and that makes them really vulnerable, right? So if their strength is not enough to withstand the onslaught from the outside, right, you get a flood, right? Like you lose all of your identity, and now you don't have any source of your identity, and now you're in domicile. So if you marry, right, and you divorce, like you're in domicile, right? Like you have the same pattern. But if you marry and you don't divorce, you get to do things that you can't without marrying.
So choice is affirmation of identity in
In
conscious
hope, in a
understanding that there's
promise.
risk of a flood, but also in keeping in mind that there's possibility of flood.
Right. There's a promise, right? So the proposal, right, or God does it in a covenant, right? Like it's a binding in a promise, right? And and the Bible says that God doesn't go back on his words, right? So like his promises will always come true, right? So like there's a hope in there, right? If you believe the Bible, that whatever he says will come to be, right? Like that's what it says. And so you can look at marriage in the same way, right? Like but I'm a human, right? Like I'm flawed, right? Like I can die, like I can like get in an accident, right? And then the promise that I made to you uh, doesn't have the same fulfillment as your expectation right now, right? And so like that's the issue with the binding, right? Like you gain strength, right? You gain cooperation, you gain union, you gain reliability, but you also gain vulnerability, right? And like if you take the vow seriously, like then you'll have to deal with the consequences either way. Just like if you would get into an accident, you have to deal with those consequences.
If I could add to that, I just wanted to kind of bring up also the another level of sort of the example of the card that I had made. So this sort of thing, of course, I was kind of, reproducing this, fruit with the seed in it, and the seed itself is a promise. So if I gave you like, the seed of a peach tree or something like that and said, here's a peach tree, it's like obviously not. But also, you go and you plant that and you remain dedicated to it, especially in the early stages. And when it's most difficult, because I can't even see anything for who knows how long as I'm watering this thing and everything, that you're holding up your end of feeding the spiritual over and over again. Super brief reference for Christopher, if he's listening. I know we missed out on him this last couple of weeks. The previous page about the showbread is something that he was looking for, if that was something he wanted to kind of dig into. But that's another kind of example of you're providing a thing that the spirit or the identity can enter into, and then that itself is then going to be something that's provided downwards, so that it can then be kind of integrated or consumed, and then given an even larger body for that. And so in the similar way, this sort of card is not just so that you can have it and it can sit there and it looks nice. I mean, that's a nice thing with the actual wooden icon, but this is a more participative thing that you're receiving the fruit, you're integrating it, and then you're supposed to eventually be a larger body hosting that. And there are particular promises included in this. People aren't doing this for 20 minutes a day because they think it's more fun than watching TV or any of those things, but also because they think that it's a good thing to do. It's not a mandatory thing for anybody to do. You have that choice, and and you can. There's plenty of people that say, hey, it's not necessary or whatever. Totally fair, but you make that decision, and you can also choose to stop making that decision daily if you wanted to, and then it'll cease manifesting or cease kind of solidifying or materializing if you wanted to, because you stop, accepting it or hosting it, and then in that
Worshipping.
way, right? Yeah, you're no longer aiming upwards, and in many ways, like with some of these things, like you're aiming through it, like it's almost kind of a like some of the shading that RJ was talking about, that if you're the black dots at the bottom, that you're using something like this almost as like a sort of aperture that would be kind of like the half shaded, so that you can then aim even higher at the bright thing, because you can't necessarily look all the way up 100% of the time, and or even at all, depending on where you are. So that's kind of another example, I guess, of the choosing that I wanted to offer.
So I really appreciate that you brought in cameras to work with here, Castle. And I do see the teeny little camera right off to your side here. I'm not going to go and grab any of my cameras or my lenses, but I will use that as a segue to say that, right. Part of what these diagrams allow us to do is to have a lens to look through things with. There's a song I might post in the comments later. If I remember the line, part of the song goes, "The good book is great. It's not enough to have a lens; you need to see through it."
Right.
So that's just my 2 cents there. But for those of us who are shutterbugs and camera heads, f-stop, ISO, all of that impacts the image that you create. And for those of us who go back to film, I would encourage people to try to think about how developing film can be thought of as a process, and one which can be
Right.
sequenced and diagrammed out according to even some of these images.
When I want to highlight, I think where people get caught up with stuff like this is the presentation is necessarily flat. It's a book with some diagrams, right? But we're talking about two different dimensions. One is time, right? And so a promise is something that isn't here now. A promise is always something that isn't manifest now for you. It might be manifest somewhere, like, I promise you're going to go to Europe. Well, Europe's here now, but you're not in Europe now. Right? And so the promise, right, is in the future. And people get really wrapped up with time because we've had this, even John Vervaeke critiques this rightly, in this particular case, this mindfulness movement, right? Which is this alleged importation from the East. It's all a lie. Just going to tell you right now, all a lie. If you look into it, you're going to find out. No, that's not. There's no such formulation in the East. It's a pure Western affectation and misunderstanding. We're focused on the here and now. And it's like, well, that's great. And you know, this is kind of Paul van der Klee has a better conception of this eyes up versus eyes down. You have to have your eyes down so you don't fall in a pit. You have to focus on the here and now to make sure that you're oriented correctly, right? But also you can't only focus on the here and now because you have to know where you're going, right? And this is what promises and choices are about. The other dimension that's important here, aside from time, is to understand that there isn't only one promise, and therefore there's not only one choice, right? The choice is not a binary choice between yes to this promise and no to this promise. There's also at least this strong implication that there are other promises around, whether in time or at the moment, that you could say yes to that maybe have a conflict. And that's when this sort of formulation becomes important, right? When you start adding the dimensions to it, the dimension of time and the dimension of there's not only one choice, there's not only one promise, there's not only one thing that you're wrapped up in, because you're a person and persons are multi-dimensional, multi-identic, right? Lots of identities. You're multi-agentic. You've lots of things you can do, right? But you can't do them all, and you can't do most of them at once, right? In fact, you can't do more than a few things at once if you're lucky. And so there are lots of choices wrapped up just in that fact. So one way to conceive of this is to say, well, what am I doing by being in this book club? How much time am I spending on this book club? Because you got to read the text beforehand, hopefully, right? Potentially take notes, unless you're me, in which case you're too lazy to take notes. And then you have to, you know, put the work in for, you know, being here for, you know, two plus hours. And then maybe you make a further choice, like crazy people like Castle made, to like make additional drawings, or RJ, who's like, oh, I'm going to find all the toys that apply to the drawings, right? Or Manuel, who's done the same, right? Now these are all, you know, not simple choices, right? Like my choice to join the book club just doesn't have a huge investiture of time. Most of that's quirks of who and what I am and what I've been doing, right? Whereas the investiture that RJ and Castle are putting in are significantly higher, right? They're just putting in more time, right? And it doesn't speak to value or anything, right? Which is also important to know. You know, your time doesn't translate directly to value. That's not true. There's a quality as well to that time and to what that time can yield, right? But all of this goes into your choice, because maybe your choice is, yeah, this book club's too much work and I'm not going to do it anymore. Right. And I think I looked at the reading today and I actually thought I was going to get through it, but it's thundering out right now. So I had to come in, but like I had to spend like 20 minutes outside preparing the outside so that I could do the book club outside and have lunch outside and all this stuff. So I didn't get the reading done quite yet, you know, although I knew we weren't going to hit 35. That was for sure. So there was a decision there about, well, you know, am I going to have it outside? Do I want to have lunch outside? Do I want to do the book club outside? Or do I want to, I've already committed to the book club. I'm going to do the reading, right? Or do I want to do all the reading, despite the fact that I don't think that we're going to get to 35, right? And my decision was, no, I'd rather do what I do outside. And if I make a mistake, if we actually get past where I read, then, you know, that's on me, right? That'll be an error on my part. So a choice isn't a simple binary thing, the way it's always presented. And it's always presented that way because it has to be. So I'm not saying like people should present this complex, time-dimensional, multi-choice dimensional way of, that's foolishness. But you have to keep that in mind, right? That choices aren't simple binary events that you get to say A or B. That never happens to you. It's never happened to you. It will never happen to you, right? And it's an illusion that ever happened, right? It's just the last two priorities on your list get in a runoff, and so it looks like you made a choice between two things. But when you have a peanut butter sandwich for lunch, you didn't decide between a peanut butter sandwich and a cup of soup, because there are a bunch of other things you already filtered off the list before you got to that point, for example. And that's true for every choice.
If I could just jump in to dovetail and tack something on. Mark, when you were talking about the things that go into choices versus decisions, for example, the investment of effort and cognitive bandwidth, etc. See Mark's videos on cognitive overload, etc. The more you put into something in a certain sense, whether that's time, actual capital, etc., the more weight it can hold for you. The more weight something can hold for you, the more it both matters, and for the fact that it matters and you don't have control over it. Sorry, I should look into the camera. For the fact that it matters and you don't have control over it can actually provoke anxiety at a certain level. So the more you care about something, the more you may invest certain thought or bandwidth into it, and you may ideate and spin out, for example. But to bring my my comment to a close and to use the diagrams, going back to the rhomboid images, there is time on the left and weight on the right, with choice on the top and investment on the bottom. Unfortunately, my handwriting is horrible, and I was using as you can see up here, we've got the wrong tool for the job as a paintbrush. Should have been using a marker. But as you guys can see that, in a way, weight is related to time through the lens of the book that we're looking at.
Also, isn't the Hebrew word for glory weight?
Do not ask me to translate when we are recording,
bro. I think it's connected. Right?
It's the same word
sounds
for
right.
the hardening of the heart of Pharaoh as the honor your father and mother commandment. It's the same word, I think.
I'm not gonna be able to say yes or no to this, guys, but I would say it's certainly worth investing some more weight into to look into some of these things.
And I wanna add a little bit to what Mark said, because I think there's two types of binding or contracts, right? So you have a contract where I say I will do this and then I will get that, right? And that gets fulfilled, right? And like it has a specific end, right? So a different way that you could see that's having mode according to Vervaeke, right? Like it's I want to do this, right? So like I work the field so that I get my harvest, right? Like B follows A, right? And then there's a being mode, right? Like and being mode has to do with quality, right? It has to do with participation in being, for its own sake in some sense, and so it's not goal oriented. It's oriented. Well, it's the journey, right? Like not the destination kind of thing. And if you have a contract like marriage, that is a thing that doesn't get fulfilled until you die, right? Because like that's where it ends, and there's no part within that it ends, and so another way to say that is it's a promise to stand at someone's side, right? So there's the promise isn't in getting something actual. The promise is in having the relationship continuously, and that's a different thing.
While we're on the topic of sacrifice, binding, contracts, and promises, the moment of the Akita, the binding of Isaac, which does not necessarily get addressed by the book, but can be seen through the lens of the book. It's an incredibly important, powerful moment in the tapestry of things. It is a moment where a promise was made, then followed through on, a sacrifice was set up, and a binding was going to be engaged, just to trace out this pattern later in the biblical, I guess, corpus, considering we did go from Genesis to Exodus. There is some parts of Genesis which are important as a pre-type potentially, to what we're looking at here in the relationship between promise, duty, fulfillment, engagement, etc. But that actually is paralleled dynamically so to the things like how the cherubim are set up over the temple and things. So if we could look at, I think it's the first diagram in 28.
Up to 28? You wanna?
Are we up to 28? I mean, we've done.
Well, I think we want to stop at 27. But,
okay.
I guess we can.
Great idea.
Because I want to kind of wind it down so that we can keep these at 2 hours. We can have some post-doc if we want. But
a mind to the structure of the time is an even better thought.
Right. So I guess I want to wind it down, and like I guess I want everybody to give a small reflection if they want on the intention, right? So taking the participatory perspective and like if that was in any way helpful and whether that changed something for you. So if anybody wants to take that.
I found it very much so. Interestingly, it was only a few moments ago when I was thinking about how to engage with what Mark was saying and some other thoughts I had, but also stay towards the telos of viewing the book and what the book has to say or show us or relate to us. Engaging it through thinking about what Mark was saying and how one could diagram that out potentially, though still trying to make sure that I'm keeping an open mind in the sense of being a student to what the book has to say, so that I am not asserting any authority of my perspective over the book, despite engaging through it, which is a difficult mediation to do as a participant, but very fruitful. In fact, maybe fruitful itself.
Essel, you want to?
Sure. Well, I think at the beginning I kind of stated my intention that I wanted to remain in a particular layer of the hierarchy and that I wanted to kind of support from below. I feel like as far as a first attempt goes at this new structure that we're operating within, that it was not a bad attempt. I think everything went about how I had hoped it would. I have more materials that I was hoping to use, but I'll raise those up next week. And then I might give a sneak preview after the camera stuff. And then otherwise, I had a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to continuing to support this, try to see if there's ways that I can improve. But overall, I think it was a success from my perspective.
So yeah, I'm happy to hear that it's clear what I mean. Like that's already like do I even communicate my intention properly? And because yeah, I've been participating through this lens, right? And I'm like we're talking about binding, right? We're talking about qualities, right? Like I think in order to perceive a quality, you need to bind yourself. I don't think it's optional. So if we're talking about promises, right? Like the quality is promised, like it's implicit in the bindings that you engage in, and I see these structures, right? Like I see them as ways to and make that binding, but also give intelligibility about the ways that you're bound in some sense. So that really stood out to me. Elena, you want to reflect a bit?
I didn't catch enough at the beginning to give a good reflection, but I will go back and listen to what you had to say.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, if everyone else is getting something out of it, then I guess it's a success. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I also never know, because you and I have no problem communicating, so I never know if anybody else understands what either of us are saying. So it sounds like a rousing success to me.
Yeah, and Danny, we haven't heard Danny the whole time.
Yeah, so I mean, I've got just a tremendous amount of thought. I think just fundamentally for my overall thesis on the book, I'm thinking very practically, or trying to think very practically about this book. So initially, I was, saying there were like the problems I was trying to address were like failure to agree on fact and category with people. And I think where I've advanced today is, well, I mean, I've always kind of held this perspective, but a lot of the themes that were brought up, like in alignment and on authority, power, etc., bring up the necessity for faith-based tools. So, for example, according to my notes on Vervaeke, a psychotechnology, which we mentioned, is a standardized way of doing things, of information processing, like language. And he says that rationality can protect us against self-deception. But that's, I think, just experience in the world just shows you that that's just false. Right? Humans can rationalize anything. Your ego can bully the logical parts of your mind for any amount of data to convince you of anything you want. And so if you think about something like a promise, that's not a psychotechnology. And one of the common themes across all of these stories in the Bible are adopting responsibility, like we mentioned, marriage, the fulfilling of duties. So when I'm thinking about interacting with people and failing to agree on certain categories, I'm meditating on how is it like we don't seem to have trouble submitting ourselves in faith-based relationships to like a band director or a sports coach, or whatever. But when it's like, more just my day-to-day relationships, I'm meditating on how can you explain to people the necessity to bind. Like rationality is not what enhances connectedness, which is what my notes on Vervaeke say. It's how can I explain to people the necessity to bind yourself and to sacrifice and to decide duties and fulfill those kind of responsibilities. That's kind of where my eyes are headed towards. So anyway, I just want to that's like kind of a high level. I have a lot more, but at a high level, that's kind of where the emphasis is in terms of what I'm getting out of this right now.
Okay, and like I want to show this, right? So like there's some positive feedback here. And I think we all also have to realize, right? Like we're here for ourselves, like that he said, but we're also providing something, right? So there's a participation that is in relation to us. Like I have my own goals in life. It's in relationship to the book club as such, right? Like we want to raise the body of the book club to as high as we can get it, right? And in some sense, we're also having an audience that get raised up with us, gets lifted up in the tide, and we're also providing something of value to them, right? Like in ways that we can't see.
Right. Which means you need to highlight that very last comment.
Okay.
Yeah. So, right, which is a good example of mediating spaces, which I think is super important because all book clubs are not created equal. I've done book clubs on this book before in other groups. I didn't stick with them for reasons, and those reasons are about the mediation of the space. And so that just highlights what a good job you're doing, Manuel. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and like I want to say that that's an affirmation of the intention and the vision that I had for the Books Club, right? So like we're embodying this mediative quality in the book club right now, right? So we're getting a participatory knowledge of these patterns that we're in whatever way.
And it's based on 3 years of work and experimentation in online groups in particular, but groups in general, and principles that John Vervaeke talked about, right? To be fair to Vervaeke, for all the things he gets wrong, he get a lot right. around things like integration and setting a space and things that we discovered in the process of doing that. So I think that's really important. It's not like we didn't wake up one day and go, oh, this is book club and here's how you do it, right? This is actually 3 years of work to know how to create these spaces and mediate them correctly.
So you want to carry this one, Mark?
Submitting to a magazine because it has something to offer, right? Submitting to the group dress code because more people are comfortable wearing pants is reasonable because of what the group offers, right? Yeah. So submitting to a magazine is a great example by Sally, right? Because you write something and you give it to the magazine, right? You submit to their editorship and publishing authority, right, in order to cooperate with them in a way, and you might get rejected, right? Like people submit stuff to magazines all the time and don't get published, right? And so that's that's really important. It's an important aspect of submission is something you do to get something more out of your interaction than you could get by yourself. Right?
The wording of Sally's comment also makes salient that submission is a type of engagement, and engagement is a type of relationship, and relations are a type of cord or binding.
Exactly.
So you are engaging at some level.
And
I would like to engage by saying, for all the folks who have watched us today, to you guys in particular, and for anybody who watches us in the future, thank you for your time and for your attention, because attention is very weighty.
Yes, and leave comments because like we like to be challenged, and we'll get back to you. So yeah, I don't know if I think we want to close down, and then maybe after we close down, we can respond a little bit to this. Like we don't want to leave that till next week.
Hopefully not at all, but yes.
So yeah, like in the integration, right? It's like I want us to attend to our participation in these patterns, like intellectually, but also emotionally and intuitively. Like, do we shy away or embrace certain roles, and what would be other ways of filling that in? Yeah, so I want to thank everybody for their wonderful contribution. I have to say that all the efforts that's being put in is definitely helping. So, like, pat on your own back. Yeah, Neuralink and AI. I think if we want to look at these things, they're images of us. Like, so if we go into this framing, right? Like you can just go further and further, and they're gonna highlight certain qualities of relationships. Like that's what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, but lesser qualities, lesser relationships. AI is purely parasitic. It can't self-generate. It can't do any of the things people claim it can do. Very clearly, too, if you use it long enough. Neuralink is just faster communication. Well, look where that's gotten us. We're not in a great place, and that's because of faster communication, partially, not entirely. So,
that has to do with integration, right? Like we have to ruminate on things, right? So like I was talking about myself struggling with these problems in the book club. I like what is the means that I get an answer? Well, I get an answer through not being in the frame, through having a higher thing reveal itself to me, so that I can get a new vision, a new perspective on what I'm doing, right? And what happens in speed? Well, speed implies interface, implies reaction, right? So that implies that you're always responsive, and if you're responding, you can't change your perspective, because like then you get flooded. Like
it's a flood, right? That's the important part. More information faster is just a flood, and what you need are filters, right? You don't want more information. You want only the relevant information. And that's where, for Vicky's relevance realization, is she's correct about that. That's super important. Whether or not you can define it is a different problem. And so, and it is exactly, as flood. That's exactly the pattern that it is. And so you have the internet, and that creates a flood of information. And the problem goes, well, a bunch of problems vanish, right? Like the problem of being able to broadcast vanishes, right? But the cost of that is a flood of information.
And you have to realize, and this is what we're seeing, what's the response to the flood? It's the Tower of Babel, right? It's the tyrannical structure. Like, what do we see in response to the internet? Tyranny.
And it's the correct response in some sense, because you just have too much stuff coming at you.
I think it's a necessary developmental response, because that's like I was talking about: discovery, organization, implementation, right? So that's a cycle that you go through. You discover something, you organize your relationship to it, like now you implement the thing properly. But if we go back to the speed aspect, right? Like if that happens too fast, then you can't properly organize, or you can't properly implement, right? And then the new change already forms, right? So now you're in a continual transmutation, right? And like when I talk to a lot of the, well, like the modern types, right? Like what's their identity? Well, their identity is fluid. Well, what does a fluid identity mean?
Right.
Like that means that they can't find rest.
Right.
They can't establish themselves.
Well, they can't get bigger than they are, right? So there's two possible responses at some level, right, without proper filtering, which is you can do that differently, but there's two proper responses. One is tyranny, tyrannical order, right? So everybody's in alignment, and the other is decentralization, where everyone's quote free to do what they want, right? But the problem is then they can't organize by definition. It's not a problem to be solved. It's a condition of the world. It's not optional. And so they fall into a situation where they're unable to get help, and they're unable to help others at the same time. And then everything gets worse for everybody, right? And under tyranny, the same thing happens, but for the opposite reason, right? No one can organize because only one person is organizing. And there is a way out of that, right? But you have to choose that way. And you can't see it as a binary, because then you're effectively, when you have a binary, you're effectively not choosing. That's really the problem, because they're not symmetrical options. You can't be free. That's not going to happen.
And
right?
So what happens, right? Like we have this image, right? And so like we have a new order instituting itself within Adam, right? Like that's the process that we're talking about, right? And that order can either be in the image of God, right? Which would make it reliable, right? It would have a heavenly relationship, or that order can be in relationship to something lesser than God, and then you get the Tower of Babel necessarily, right? It's like that will break at some point. And I think we are at the end. Thanks for watching, and see you all next week. I think we're going the right direction with this.